A millionaire froze when he saw a little girl crying at his wife's grave. When he learned why, he cried too. He was a man known across cities for building skyscrapers, owning half the downtown properties, and for his cold, calculated demeanor. People said Edward Langston was made of numbers and concrete. But that morning, in the quietest corner of the cemetery, all of that power fell away because when he saw a little girl crying at his wife's grave, something inside him shattered. He bent down to ask why, and her answer crushed him in a way that no amount of wealth could shield him from. You're watching Storytelling and Beyond, where every story is a journey into the heart. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss these unforgettable tales of kindness, twists, and transformation. Edward Langston had visited the grave of his late wife Martha every Sunday for the last 2 years. No matter how packed his business schedule, no matter what deals were closing in Tokyo or Paris, he always made it home for this one appointment he could never miss. That morning was no different until it was. The sun had just begun to rise over the hills of Maplewood Cemetery, casting a golden hue over the dew-covered grass. The autumn wind danced gently through the trees, rustling leaves that had started to fall. As Edward stepped out of his sleek black Bentley, a bouquet of white lilies in his hand, his polished shoes crunched softly against the gravel path. He walked toward Martha's grave slowly, as always, lost in thought. But then he stopped. Someone was already there. A small girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sat cross-legged right in front of the headstone. Her hair was tied in uneven ponytails, her clothes a bit too thin for the season, her shoes scuffed. She was holding something tightly in her hands, an envelope, while her shoulders trembled with soft sobs. Edward frowned. His instinct was to turn back and give her space, but something pulled him closer. He cleared his throat gently so as not to startle her. "Excuse me, little one, are you all right?" The girl startled slightly, looked up, and quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She was pale but composed herself with surprising strength. "I didn't know anyone else came here," she said quietly. Edward's voice softened. "This is my wife's grave. Martha Langston. Did you know her?" The girl's eyes widened. "Miss Martha? She was your wife?" He nodded, puzzled. The little girl clutched the envelope to her chest. "She used to tell me stories when Mama was working at your house. She'd sneak me cookies and sing songs to me while she brushed my hair. She told me to be brave, even when things got scary at home." Edward's breath caught. Who are you?" "My name's Lucy," she said shyly. "My mama was Miss Clara. She cleaned your house for a few years. Miss Martha said I could visit her in the garden if I stayed quiet." The name stirred something faint in Edward's memory. Clara, the soft-spoken maid who disappeared from service a while ago. He remembered Martha mentioning she was raising a daughter alone, but he hadn't paid much attention then. Edward knelt down slowly beside Lucy, his expensive suit brushing the damp grass. "What happened to your mama?" Lucy's lips quivered. "She got sick. Real sick. She died last month." Edward's heart twisted. "I live at the shelter now," she continued. "I saved the lunch money the nice teacher gave me, and took the bus to come here. I had to say goodbye to Miss Martha too." She looked down and extended the envelope with trembling hands. "This is for her." Edward gently took the envelope. It was sealed with a sticker and smelled faintly of crayons. Inside was a hand-drawn picture, Lucy sitting in a garden while a lady with gray hair and kind eyes read her a story. Underneath, a child's handwriting read, "Thank you for loving me when no one else did." Tears filled Edward's eyes. He turned to the gravestone, his fingers brushing the cold marble. "Martha, what else didn't I know?" Lucy stood slowly, brushing dirt off her skirt. "I have to go before the shelter lady notices I'm missing." Edward looked at her, truly looked, for the first time in a long while, not as a millionaire, but as a man who'd missed something important, something sacred. "Lucy," he said softly, "can I drive you back?" She hesitated. "You don't have to, sir." "But I want to." His voice was barely above a whisper. As they walked toward the car together, the bouquet of lilies forgotten at the graveside, the wind picked up slightly as if Martha herself was smiling down on them, watching a new chapter beginning. Edward sat quietly in the car as it rolled down the winding road from Maplewood Cemetery, glancing every so often at Lucy seated beside him. She held her little backpack on her lap with both hands, as if afraid it might slip away. Her feet barely touched the floor of the Bentley, and her eyes darted out the window, unsure of what to say or expect. He cleared his throat gently. "So, Lucy, do you like school?" She nodded without looking at him. "It's okay. Miss Hall gives me books to read when I finish early. I like books." Edward smiled faintly. Martha loved books too. She used to read the whole morning in the sunroom. I think she would have liked hearing that. Lucy looked up, a spark of comfort in her eyes. She said stories can take you anywhere, even if you don't have a ticket. He paused, struck by the wisdom Martha must have shared with the girl. That sounds exactly like something she would say. There was a long moment of silence before Lucy spoke again, this time more softly. "Are you mad that I came to her grave?" He turned to her, surprised. "Mad? No, not at all. I'm grateful. You remembered her. You loved her. That means more than you know." She shifted in her seat. "Sometimes I dream of her. She's sitting in the garden with Mama. They're laughing. Then they both look at me and tell me it's going to be okay." Edward's throat tightened. He blinked rapidly and gripped the steering wheel tighter. She always had a way of comforting people. They reached the shelter, a modest brick building tucked beside a church. Edward pulled up and parked the car. For a moment, neither moved. Then Lucy slowly opened the door, slipping her backpack over her shoulder. "I know you're busy, Mr. Langston. Thank you for the ride," she said, standing beside the car like a little soldier. Edward stepped out quickly. "Lucy, wait." He came around the car and crouched beside her. "Would you mind if I came to see you again? Maybe brought you a few books?" Her eyes lit up. "You would do that?" "I'd like to," he said, smiling. "I'd like to know more about your stories. And maybe you can tell me more about what Martha meant to you." Lucy nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, please." As she walked up the front steps of the shelter, Edward watched her, the weight of her small figure somehow pressing more deeply into his chest than the weight of all the real estate deals he'd ever done. He didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he sat in the car for a while, staring out the windshield with the crayon drawing Lucy had given him now resting in his lap. A security guard from the shelter approached to check on him. "Sir? Everything all right?" Edward looked up, a faraway look in his eyes. "I think I just met a little piece of my wife's heart, and I almost missed it." He drove off slowly, past the city streets that now seemed a little less hollow, a little more filled with unseen grace. A week later, the soft afternoon light spilled across the polished floor of Edward Langston's study. The room, once silent and heavy with the absence of Martha, now held the sounds of pages turning, faint giggles, and the quiet murmur of an old man reading aloud. Lucy sat cross-legged on the large rug, surrounded by a few new books, each hand-picked by Edward himself. Her shoes were off, her face animated. Edward sat across from her in his leather armchair, glasses perched low on his nose, reading the final lines of the fairy tale. And so, the little girl returned home, not with gold, but with something far more precious as kindness, shared and remembered. He looked up and smiled. "The end." Lucy clapped softly. "That was my favorite one." Edward chuckled. "Mine too, I think." She tilted her head. "You never read stories before?" He shook his head. "Not in a long time. But I've been missing out, haven't I?" Lucy smiled proudly and nodded. Later, Edward sat with a family court representative in the next room, his expression serious and determined. The lawyer laid out the papers across the coffee table. "We'll start with temporary guardianship. If no relatives contest, full custody can be filed within a few weeks. She has no immediate family listed." Edward signed the forms with a firm hand. "She's not going anywhere else. My wife loved her. That's enough for me. The lawyer looked up. Mr. Langston, this is a big change. Are you certain? Edward looked toward the door, where Lucy sat with her shoes off, trying to read upside down from a book she clearly adored. I've built towers, companies, empires, he said. But none of them ever smiled at me like that little girl did. I'm more than certain. That evening, Edward took Lucy upstairs to the guest room he'd had renovated for her, soft lavender walls, a small bookshelf already half full, and a framed photo of her and Martha in the garden, scanned from an old staff album he'd found. Lucy gasped when she walked in. Is this really mine? Edward nodded. I thought maybe you'd like it here. Just for now, until you decide if it feels like home. She ran over to the bed, touching the soft comforter. It's so warm, like how Miss Martha used to hug me. He smiled. Well, then that means it's perfect. She turned to him, a little hesitantly. Can I still go visit her sometimes? Edward knelt down beside her. Of course. Every Sunday. We'll go together. Lucy grinned and suddenly threw her arms around his neck. He hesitated, caught off guard, but then returned the hug, gently but fully. Something inside him settled, as if Martha's spirit had walked quietly into the room and nodded in approval. That night, the Langston mansion, once hollow with grief, was filled with a new kind of silence, the soft, peaceful silence of a child sleeping safely in a home that had found its soul again. The sun was high over the rolling lawns of the Langston estate, casting golden light on the garden that Martha had once lovingly tended. Now, new life had taken root not just among the roses and lavender, but in the laughter echoing across the yard. Lucy ran barefoot on the soft grass, chasing bubbles that floated up from a small machine Edward had reluctantly ordered online after she insisted they were good for thinking happy thoughts. She wore a sky-blue dress Martha might have picked herself, and her cheeks were flushed with joy. Edward watched from the porch, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. A cup of tea sat forgotten beside him. In his lap was a book, its pages dog-eared by small hands. Grandpa Ed. Lucy shouted, pausing to catch her breath. Can we go see Miss Martha today? He smiled. Of course. Let's take her some of your cupcakes. I'm sure she misses you. Lucy nodded solemnly, then scampered back inside to pack a little tin she'd prepared earlier with help from the cook. She added a paper napkin with pink flowers drawn in marker and her newest crayon picture. A sketch of her, Edward, and Martha standing under a big tree with birds flying above them. Later that afternoon, they arrived at the cemetery, hand in hand. Edward carried a blanket and the cupcake tin. Lucy carried her drawing, folded neatly and pressed against her heart. They spread the blanket beside the headstone, just like a picnic. Edward poured tea into 2 paper cups. He placed one near the gravestone, the other beside Lucy. She'd like this, Lucy whispered. She always liked tea outside. Edward nodded, then carefully took out a small locket and opened it. Inside was a photo of Martha holding a much younger Edward's face in her hands, both of them laughing. She would have loved you, Lucy. But I think you already knew that. Lucy placed the drawing at the base of the headstone, then leaned her head on Edward's shoulder. I think she sent me to find you, she said softly. So you wouldn't be lonely anymore. Edward's eyes blurred with tears, and he placed a hand gently over hers. Or maybe she sent you to help me remember what it means to live. The wind picked up gently, rustling the trees. Birds chirped nearby, and for a moment, it felt as though the garden Martha once loved had been reborn in that very spot. As they packed up, Lucy looked up at him. Grandpa Ed, do you think Miss Martha is happy in heaven? He crouched beside her and cupped her face in his hands. I think she's smiling right now. Because you made sure she was never forgotten. And that's the greatest kind of love. They walked away slowly, the grave behind them covered in flowers, a child's drawing, and crumbs from cupcakes shared with someone dearly missed. And though grief still lived in the corners of Edward's heart, it no longer filled the whole house. Because now, every corner echoed with small footsteps, laughter, and the innocent, healing kindness of a little girl who once cried alone at a grave. And instead found a home. You're watching Storytelling and Beyond, where even the smallest kindness can change a life forever. Subscribe now for more true to heart stories that will touch your soul.